Snow drifted across the empty winter station like torn pieces of a forgotten letter, scattering themselves along the splintered boards, as if the wind were trying to gather them back together. Lantern light trembled against the frosted glass, sending thin gold ribbons across the lonely platform. In that trembling glow stood a young woman, who had already lived through too many nights like this. Eliza Hartwell, 23, beautiful in the soft, unassuming way of someone who had learned to swallow pain before tears could form, pressed a hand to the small of her aching back, and tried to steady her breath against the chill biting through her threadbare shawl. The world around her felt as brittle as the ice forming along the rafters. Her swollen belly shifted beneath her palms, and she whispered an apology to the child growing within her, as though she feared winter itself might overhear and punish her for daring to bring life into such a season. Her boots, cracked at the seams, were soaked with melted snow. Each step she took left behind a dark print that vanished almost as quickly as she made it. Yet even as she trembled, there was something steady in the way she held herself, a quiet resolve forged from months of endurance. She had come here hoping for shelter, believing that despite everything, someone might still remember she existed. Mr. Alden Pike, the station keeper, shuffled toward her with a sorrowful look carved deep into the lines of his weathered face. His beard was stiff with frost, and his gloved hands trembled as he locked the station door for the night. Eliza approached him with cautious hope, the kind of hope that has been bruised but refuses to die completely. She asked him, voice raw from cold and fear, if she might stay inside until morning, if she might just find warmth long enough to keep the child safe through the night. Alden's eyes softened, but his shoulders sagged beneath the truth he had no power to change. The train station had no firewood left, no blankets, and no authority that allowed him to keep her in after hours. He apologized with a gentleness that made her chest tighten, because even kindness felt heavy when it could not save her. She turned then, directing her gaze toward the one man she once believed she could depend on. Caleb Boone leaned against a post near the edge of the platform, hat pulled low, coat buttoned tight, boots dry and well-maintained, the very picture of a man untouched by winter's cruelty. Once, months ago, he had offered her warm smiles and promises that sounded like safety. Now he glanced up only long enough to see her approaching before shifting away from her, as if she carried the storm itself in her arms. She asked him, voice trembling, whether he might walk her to a nearby cabin, whether he remembered the words he had spoken before the world shifted beneath her feet. He scoffed, muttering that she wasn't his responsibility, that he had troubles of his own, that a woman who couldn't manage her own choices shouldn't expect a man to clean up after them. Each word fell like a stone into the hollow places inside her, but she didn't cry. Winter had already taken too much from her to allow tears the privilege of escape. She backed away slowly, cradling her belly, whispering again to her unborn child that she was trying, that she always had been. The wind rose sharply, howling through the cracks of the station walls as though warning her that she had lingered too long in a place that had nothing left to offer. Lantern flames flickered violently. A loose shutter banged open. And then, beneath the roar of wind, came the sound of heavy footsteps crushing snow with deliberate weight. A presence emerged from the darkness just beyond the platform, tall enough to shift the air, strong enough to silence the whispers of fear creeping through her ribs. Taza Redhawk stepped into the light like a figure carved from the mountain itself. Snow clung to his long black hair and broad bare shoulders, unmelted despite the warmth spilling from the lantern nearby. His chest rose and fell with the slow, controlled breath of a man who had faced storms far greater than the ones surrounding them now. The station patrons stiffened, watching him with that uneasy blend of fear and awe people reserved for those they did not understand. Taza paid them no mind. His gaze moved past them all until it landed on Eliza, on her shivering frame, her trembling hands, the way she held her belly like a shield she could not lower. He approached her with a stillness that felt like compassion disguised as caution. His voice, when it finally cut through the wind, was low and quiet, the kind of voice that could steady a restless heartbeat. He told her the storm was sharpening, that the night would grow cruel, that no woman should face winter alone, certainly not one so close to bringing new life into the world. He offered his cabin, explaining in simple words that there was warmth, fire, blankets, food, safety. Eliza hesitated. Not because she feared him, but because the world had taught her that kindness often hid teeth. Yet when another contraction seized her, Bending her forward, forcing a groan from deep within her throat, she realized she no longer had the luxury of mistrust. The winter would not wait for her courage to catch up. Her child would not wait for her fears to dissolve. She steadied herself and looked into Taza's eyes, dark, unwavering, patient, and felt something inside her shift. Not surrender. Not desperation. Something closer to recognition. As if her weary soul had finally stumbled upon a place where it could stop running. Taza extended his hand. Not commanding. Not expecting. Simply offering. She placed her own chilled hand into his palm, and warmth traveled up her arm like the first breath of spring breaking through frost. Caleb scoffed behind them, muttering something she didn't bother to hear. The station keeper bowed his head as if an apology for the world's shortcomings. But Eliza did not look back. She stepped beside the giant Apache, letting him guide her into the white silence of the storm. The wind swallowed them quickly, leaving nothing but footprints behind. And as the last lantern flickered in the station window, Eliza realized with a quiet, trembling certainty that she had just walked into the only path left to her, and perhaps the only one meant for her all along. Taza led Eliza through the winter darkness with the steady certainty of a man who had walked storms since childhood, each step deliberate, each breath measured against the cold slicing across the open plains. Snow swirled around them like restless spirits searching for warmth, clinging to her lashes, gathering on his broad shoulders, though he did not shiver. Eliza leaned heavily on his arm, breath trembling with every movement. The world behind them, the station, the rejection, the cold indifference, seemed to fade into a distant ache as his quiet presence formed a fragile barrier around her fear. When his cabin finally appeared as a faint silhouette against the pale moonlight, Eliza felt her knees weaken from a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Inside, the warmth struck her first. A soft, living heat rising from a central fire built with care rather than haste, glowing against the sturdy wooden walls. The scent of pine resin and smoked meat drifted through the small space. Furs were arranged neatly along the floor, blankets folded with precision, tools hung in ordered lines. It was not luxury, but it was sanctuary. Taza guided her toward a place near the fire, lowering her with surprising gentleness for a man shaped like carved granite. She exhaled shakily as warmth seeped into her bones, melting the ache lodged deep beneath her ribs. For a moment she simply sat there, clutching her belly, feeling the baby shift as though sensing the sudden safety. Taza moved quietly about the room, stirring embers, setting a kettle over the flames, retrieving blankets from a chest carved with symbols she did not recognize. He draped one across her shoulders with a tenderness that stunned her. The fabric was heavy and soft, smelling faintly of sage and smoke. Eliza closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden contrast between the bitter world she had left outside and the gentle haven she now found herself in. He asked nothing of her, not her past, not her secrets, not her gratitude. His silence was not cold. It was patient, almost reverent, as if he understood that words could wound when spoken too soon. When the tea was ready, he placed the wooden cup in her hands, fingers brushing lightly against her trembling ones. The herbal mixture warmed her belly, and eased the throbbing pain gathering low in her spine. She watched him from beneath lowered lashes, noticing how he kept a respectful distance, never turning his back fully to her, as though honoring her vulnerability. The firelight traced the contours of his muscles, the broad curve of his shoulders, the scars along his forearms. Yet nothing about him felt threatening. He carried his strength with humility, letting it serve rather than dominate the space around him. Eliza tried to speak, her voice cracking as she attempted to thank him, but he lifted a hand slightly, inviting her to rest instead. Words could come later. Safety came first. She nodded, fighting a swell of emotion she hadn't expected to feel. Nobody had cared for her like this, not since her mother, not since life had turned hard and narrow. She shifted closer to the fire, feeling the tension in her body begin to release. Her child kicked softly, almost rhythmically, and she whispered a promise she hoped she could keep, that she would find a way to mend the broken edges of their future. Taza sat near the doorway, his back straight, spear beside him, eyes scanning the drifting snow beyond the window as though watching for dangers she could not see. She realized then that he was not simply offering shelter. He was guarding her. Guarding her child. guarding the fragile thread of hope stretched thin between her breaths. A quiet gratitude spread through her chest. She studied the strong lines of his face, the calm intensity in his gaze, and wondered what kind of grief had shaped him into a man who protected strangers without question. Something inside her sensed a wound in him, deep and quiet, shaped long before she ever stumbled into his world. When another contraction rolled through her, sharper this time, she let out a small gasp before she could stop herself. Taza rose instantly, crossing the room with silent urgency. He knelt beside her with the steady patience of someone who understood pain, placing a firm hand behind her back to support her as she breathed through it. His touch grounded her, pulling her back from the edge of panic. When the spasm passed, she leaned forward, eyes burning with tears she had held back for too long. Taza did not look away. He waited until she calmed, then handed her another blanket, adjusting it gently around her shoulders, as though caring for her was as natural as breathing. She finally found her voice and asked him, softly, why he had stopped for her at the station. Why he had stepped forward when others stepped away. His expression shifted with the faintest shadow, a memory crossing behind his eyes. He told her in few words that winter was unkind to life in all its forms. That he had once lost someone he could not save. That he would not let the season claim another mother, another child, not while he had strength left in his body. His voice held both grief and conviction, woven together like threads from the same cloth. Eliza felt something warm and painful unfurl inside her at the quiet honesty of his confession. He stoked the fire again, adding logs with practiced ease, then began preparing a place for her to rest. He arranged furs into a soft bed, layering them for warmth, smoothing them until he was satisfied. When he invited her to lie down, he turned away respectfully, giving her privacy. Eliza lowered herself onto the furs, feeling the softness cradle her aching body. The fire cast a slow, dancing glow across the cabin, painting Taza's shadow onto the wall like a guardian spirit etched in amber. She let her eyes drift closed, exhaustion tugging at her, but fear tugged back just as fiercely. Taza must have sensed her unease, because he spoke quietly without turning. He told her she was safe, that nothing would harm her under his roof, that the storm could howl, and the world could turn harsh, but within these walls she would not be alone. The sincerity in his tone brushed against the fragile parts of her heart like a steadying hand. She breathed slowly, testing the truth of his promise, and found comfort blooming where fear had been crowding her ribs. As her breathing evened out, she felt a shift in the air. Something subtle, something sacred. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't trust fully formed. It was the faint beginning of belonging, like the first warm current beneath a frozen river hinting that spring might still exist. She sensed that this cabin, this night, this man might alter the course of her life in ways she could not foresee. And though the thought frightened her, it also wrapped itself around her like a thin ribbon of hope. When the next contraction came, sharper, deeper, she gripped the blanket, eyes flying open as fear surged again. Taza turned swiftly, reading the pain on her face before she spoke. He stepped toward her, voice calm, steady as a heartbeat carried through earth. And in that moment, as the storm hammered against the walls and her child pressed insistently toward the world, Eliza understood that the journey she had begun that night was far from over, and that the safety she clung to might soon depend on more than warmth and furs. It might depend on him. The storm deepened through the night, swelling against the cabin walls with the relentless force of something ancient and hungry. Wind screamed past the windows, seizing handfuls of snow and hurling them like shards of shattered glass against the logs. Inside, the fire struggled to keep pace with the rising cold, flames bending as though bowing to a power greater than themselves. Eliza lay on the layered furs, her breathing sharp and uneven, a sheen of sweat gathering across her brow despite the chill seeping in. Her contractions had grown closer, heavier, like waves determined to pull her beneath their weight. She clutched the edge of the blanket, knuckles pale, trying to remember how to breathe the way the midwife from her hometown once taught her. But memory had become slippery, drifting out of reach just when she needed it most. Taza moved around her with steady purpose, feeding the fire, fetching water, placing warm stones near her feet. His silence carried a gravity that anchored her through each tremor of pain. He did not speak unless necessary, but his presence filled the room with a calm that felt like the only barrier between her and the storm trying to tear apart the night. Whenever she cried out, his hand found hers, large and warm, grounding her against the rising panic curling through her chest. He told her in quiet tones shaped by patience that she was strong, that her body knew what to do, that he would not leave her side. When a particularly brutal contraction seized her, she gasped and folded over herself, tears spilling from the corners of her eyes. Fear rose like a tide, fear of dying, fear of failing, fear of the world that had already taken so much. Her voice broke as she whispered that she couldn't do it alone. Taza didn't hesitate. He stood, pulled on his heavy boots, grabbed his thickest cloak, and told her he would bring help. Before she could protest, he stepped into the screaming winter without another word. Eliza lay back, listening to the storm swallow him whole. The cabin felt suddenly too large, too quiet despite the howling outside. She reached a shaky hand toward the fire, needing its warmth, its light, its reminder that she was still here. Her breaths came in quick bursts, trembling as though they were learning to navigate this new terror. She whispered to the child inside her that they needed to hold on, just a little longer, that someone was coming, that she needed them to stay alive. She clung to the fur beneath her, fighting against the sensation that the storm was inside her ribcage now, swirling, gathering, preparing to break her open from the inside out. Meanwhile, Taza pressed through the blizzard with a determination bordering on fury. Snow rose past his shins, wind clawing at his face, but he kept moving, driven by the memory of a sister he once failed to save in a storm much like this one. He would not repeat that mistake. Not tonight. Not with this woman who had stepped into his life carrying both sorrow and unexpected strength. He found Martha Quinn's cabin after what felt like hours, though it had been less than one. Martha, sturdy and sharp-eyed despite the late hour, saw the urgency in his stance and didn't waste breath asking questions. She bundled herself in thick wool, grabbed her supplies, and climbed onto his back when the snow proved too deep for her to walk. He carried her through the storm as though she weighed nothing, his steps carving a determined path through the white chaos. When they returned, Eliza was curled on her side, breath trembling, face pale as moonlight. Relief hit her like warm water when she saw Taza's silhouette in the doorway, snow rushing in around him. Martha hurried to her side, her practiced hands already movement-ready, checking Eliza's pulse, her breathing, the timing of her contractions. She spoke to Eliza with a reassuring steadiness, encouraging her to use the pain instead of fighting it, reminding her that fear had no power over a woman determined to bring life into the world. Eliza nodded through tears, clinging to every word like a lifeline. Taza moved around the room quietly, tending the fire, heating blankets, preparing water. His movements were purposeful, reverent almost, as though the cabin had become a sacred space where life and death hovered close enough to touch. When Eliza reached for him during a surge of pain, he knelt instantly beside her. She clung to his hand with a desperation born not from weakness, but from the primal instinct to survive. His other hand pressed gently against her back, steadying her breath, guiding her through each wave. He murmured soft encouragement in both English and his native Apache tongue, the cadence rhythmic and soothing even when the words were unfamiliar. Hours blurred together, the storm roaring and retreating in great, feral breaths. Eliza pushed with all the strength she had left, her cries mingling with the wind outside. Martha coached her through each moment, voice firm and grounded. Taza remained at her side, a fortress against the storm both outside and within her body. With one final push, a thin, piercing wail filled the cabin, raw, new, alive. Eliza collapsed back against the furs, sobbing with exhaustion and relief as Martha lifted the tiny squirming child into the warm firelight. "A girl," Martha announced, her voice softening as she wrapped the newborn in a clean blanket. "A strong one. A fighter." Eliza reached trembling arms toward her daughter, pulling the tiny bundle against her chest. The warmth of the child's small body melted the last pieces of fear clinging to her heart. She whispered promises through broken breaths, promising protection, promising love, promising a life better than the one she had known. Tears slid down her cheeks, but they were not the tears of despair she had carried for months. They were tears of triumph, of survival, of beginnings. Taza stood over them, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then something softened in him. A quiet release, a lifting of an old weight he had carried too long. He touched the baby's forehead with the back of his fingers, whispering a blessing in Apache, thanking the spirits for her safe arrival. Eliza watched him with a swelling in her chest she did not yet understand. His presence, his strength, his unwavering commitment. He had become the promise she once searched for in all the wrong places. Morning arrived with a pale, uncertain light. The storm had quieted but not ended. Snow still drifted lazily from the sky, covering the world in a blanket of white. Eliza slept, exhausted, the baby nestled against her heart. Taza stood watch near the door, sharpening his spear for the day ahead. It was then that footsteps approached through the snow, heavy, determined, uninvited. When Caleb Boone appeared in the doorway, frost on his coat and bitterness in his eyes, Taza stiffened. Caleb's gaze landed on the baby, then on Eliza sleeping with the fragile exhaustion of a woman who had fought for life itself. He demanded entry, demanded answers, demanded rights he had long since forfeited. Taza stepped between him and the bed without a word. Caleb barked accusations, insisting he should be the one to decide the child's future. But Taza's silence held more power than any argument. It was the silence of a promise kept. When Caleb took one step too many, Eliza stirred, blinking awake just long enough to see the man who had abandoned her. Her grip tightened instinctively around her child. Her voice, though weak, carried a strength she had not possessed before this night. She told him he had no claim here. Not to her, not to the life she had brought into the world, not to the future she was choosing. Caleb sputtered in rage, but the sight of Taza's towering stance forced him back. He retreated into the snow with curses that vanished in the wind. When the door shut, the cabin fell quiet again. But something had changed. The storm outside was no longer the greatest threat. The threat now lingered in the world beyond the cabin walls, a reminder that peace was fragile and choices carried consequences. Taza stood there, gaze steady, understanding settling over him like falling snow. They were no longer fighting a storm of weather. They were fighting a storm of men. Winter softened slowly after the birth, loosening its iron grip on the cabin with each pale sunrise. The snow still lay deep across the valley, but its edges had begun to melt, revealing hints of soil and stone beneath the white. Inside Taza's home, a gentler thaw unfolded. One born not of weather, but of two wounded lives learning to breathe in the same quiet space. Eliza woke each morning with her daughter nestled against her, the child's soft breaths reminding her that she had crossed a threshold no storm could undo. Taza's silhouette was always near, sharpening tools, tending the fire, or carving wood with the deliberate calm of a man who had learned long ago that silence was a kind of protection. She watched him sometimes when he didn't notice, realizing she relied on that calm more each day. The cabin had become a sanctuary, but it was his steadiness that made it feel like a place where safety could take root. He brought her food without ceremony, warm stews, ground herbs, fresh water warmed over the flames. She began helping when she could, though her body still trembled from the strain of childbirth. When she reached for a pot or stirred a mixture, she noticed how he watched her with careful awareness, stepping in only when she faltered. He treated her not as someone fragile, but as someone precious, deserving of protection without possession. Her gratitude deepened quietly, weaving itself through her thoughts like threads pulled from old cloth. She wondered if he realized how much his quiet presence shielded her from the shadows Caleb's return had stirred inside her. Even now, she felt the echo of his boots in the snow, the threat he carried, the uncertain future he represented. She had never confronted a man before Taza's arrival at her side. Now she found herself drawing strength from the memory of how Taza stood between them like a wall carved from the earth itself. Some afternoons, when the baby slept and the light fell softly over the wooden floor, Eliza and Taza spoke in low, wandering tones. Their conversations drifted like smoke, unhurried, open, often meandering into places neither expected. She told him pieces of her past, the small family farm, her mother's early death, the loneliness that followed. She confessed how easily she once mistook attention for affection. Taza listened with the attentiveness of someone gathering fallen feathers to keep them safe. When he spoke in return, his words came slowly, revealing fragments of the history he rarely shared. She learned how his people had been forced from ancestral lands, How hunger and grief had shaped entire winters. How his sister's death during a storm left a wound he carried like a scar beneath the skin. His honesty was soft, never demanding sympathy. Yet every secret he revealed felt like a key placed gently in her palm. She held each one with silent reverence. Days lengthened, bringing a fragile peace neither dared name. Eliza began tending small tasks around the cabin, mending blankets, organizing tools, sweeping the floor with rhythmic strokes that brought a gentle order to the space. She found comfort in shaping the world inside these walls, building small rituals that steadied her heart. Taza noticed her efforts and adjusted his own routines to match, preparing firewood earlier, fetching water before dawn, ensuring she always had what she needed to care for her daughter. There was an unspoken partnership growing between them, one built not from expectation, but from shared resilience. They moved through the cabin like two halves of a story, slowly learning how to meet in the same line. Sometimes, when evening settled and the baby slept in her cradle, the world around them shifted into something softer. Eliza would sit near the fire, brushing her fingers along the carved wooden toys Taza shaped for the child. She marveled at the way his large hands created something so delicate. Taza would glance up from his work, as if sensing her admiration even without seeing it. Their eyes met occasionally, and in those moments, neither looked away. A warmth unfurled between them, fragile yet undeniable, blooming quietly like a dawn no one had predicted. Eliza found herself anticipating those shared glances, wondering what they meant, wondering why her breath always softened when he offered her even the faintest smile. Despite the growing tenderness, a lingering fear shadowed her thoughts. Caleb's abrupt appearance had shaken something deep inside her, reminding her that the world outside the cabin still had claims on her life. Some days she expected to hear his boots crunching through the snow again, bringing accusations or worse. She didn't know what he wanted, only that he believed he deserved access to the child he once denied. Taza sensed her anxiety even when she didn't voice it. His steps grew more vigilant, his ears tuned to every sound outside, his posture shifting slightly whenever the wind changed. He never spoke of the threat directly, but Eliza felt the shield he placed around her, silent and unwavering. One afternoon, while the wind hummed softly against the roof, Eliza stepped outside to gather a bucket of snow for melting. For the first time since the birth, she felt strong enough to face the cold. The air was crisp, the sky pale with winter's lingering hold. As she scooped the snow, she glanced toward the path that led to town, the path Caleb had used. A tightness settled in her chest. The road waited like a reminder that her sanctuary lived on borrowed time. She stood there longer than she intended, staring at the horizon until Taza appeared behind her, his shadow falling across her boots. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, a quiet wall at her back, his presence grounding her. She breathed deeply, letting the fear drain slowly into the snow at her feet. When she finally turned, he met her gaze with a gentleness that unraveled the knot inside her. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding etched into every quiet line of his face. She whispered that she feared what Caleb might try next. Taza nodded, acknowledging danger without letting it define the moment. He told her she wasn't alone anymore, that the child wasn't unprotected, that the cabin was stronger with two souls guarding the same flame. His reassurance settled into her like warm water. Even as the days continued to pass with a sense of careful harmony, Eliza felt something else awakening inside her, a stirring she was afraid to name. She caught herself watching Taza with a tenderness that startled her, finding comfort in the way he moved, the sound of his footsteps, the steady tone of his voice. She wondered if he felt the same quiet pull, though he never let emotion slip beyond the respectful distance he kept. Still, she sensed something waiting beneath the surface, something that moved like a river under ice. That unspoken current grew stronger the night she found him carving a cradle piece by the fire. The glow illuminated his face, revealing a softness she hadn't seen before, a kind of longing buried too deep to name. When he looked up and caught her watching, neither of them looked away. A breathless pause filled the room, stretching between them like a thin, fragile thread. She felt the shift deep in her chest, the beginning of something inevitable. But before either could speak, a distant sound shattered the stillness. A horse's hooves breaking through the hardened snow outside, drawing closer with a determined rhythm. Eliza's heart stilled. And Taza rose to his feet with the quiet certainty of a man, preparing to face whatever storm waited on the other side of the door. The sound of hooves carved through the quiet like a warning the earth itself had tried to swallow. Eliza froze near the cradle, breath trembling as she clutched the wooden edge for balance. Taza stepped toward the door with the steady composure of a man who carried storms in his shadow. When he opened it, cold air surged inside, wrapping around them with sharp, unforgiving fingers. Caleb Boone sat atop his horse, posture rigid, face drawn tight with something between anger and wounded pride. The last light of day clung to the snow, casting him in a pale, uncertain glow. Taza stood silent, his figure blocking the doorway so completely that Caleb's gaze had no path to reach Eliza. Caleb demanded to see the baby, insisted he had a right, insisted blood alone gave him claim. But his voice betrayed him, quivering under the weight of a guilt he wouldn't name. Taza answered with quiet strength, telling him the child would not be claimed by a man who abandoned her mother in the cold. Caleb's pride faltered, breaking beneath the truth he had so long avoided. He looked past Taza, eyes darting toward the small movement where Eliza's silhouette hovered. She stepped forward despite her trembling. Her voice, though soft, carried a finality that stunned the fading daylight. She told him the child was not his to shape, not his to rescue now that she was safe, not his destiny to rewrite after turning away when winter pressed hardest. Caleb's expression collapsed into something hollow. He opened his mouth as if to speak again, but the words died on the cold air. With a sharp pull of the reins, he turned and rode into the growing dusk, swallowed by the vast white silence that stretched across the valley. When the door closed, the cabin did not feel smaller. It felt fuller, as though the absence of threat created space for something long waiting to bloom. Eliza sank onto a stool, breath unsteady, tears slipping down her cheeks more from release than fear. Taza knelt in front of her, his hands steadying her trembling ones. He spoke softly, telling her she had shown more courage in a single moment than many men find in a lifetime. She stared at him, realizing the trembling inside her wasn't from the confrontation, but from the way he looked at her, as if he had been holding back 1,000 unspoken truths. The fire cracked gently behind him, painting amber warmth across his sharp features. He reached up and brushed a tear from her cheek with a tenderness that pierced something deep inside her. His touch lingered, hesitant but full of unrestrained reverence. She whispered his name, soft as breath, soft as hope. And that whisper cracked open the restraint he had worn since the night he carried her from the station. He told her he had tried to keep distance, tried to offer only shelter, tried not to let feelings shape the care he gave her. But every day, every breath, every moment watching her cradle her child rewove something in him he believed winter had killed. He confessed that he loved her, not with sudden passion, but with the slow, steady devotion of a man who had learned to love through loss. Eliza felt the world shift beneath her, not in fear, but in recognition. She touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw, feeling the warmth of someone who had become her refuge long before she had realized it. She whispered that she loved him too, that safety had found her in the shape of his hands, his silence, his unwavering heart. He pulled her gently into his arms as though afraid she might dissolve, holding her against the drum of his heartbeat, while the sky outside broke open into a wash of stars, blessing the future rising quietly between them.